Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Michelle Castle. I'm one of the senior managers here at the Environmental Commissioner's Office. Today, I'm going to present a webinar which will cover highlights from our recent report, Good Choices, Bad Choices, which was released in October. Before I introduce Commissioner Diane Sachs, I just want to run through a few technical details about the webinar quickly. The presentation will take about 40 minutes, and after that, we'll do questions. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar by going into the Go to Webinar window on the right side of your screen. If you don't see the question box, click on the little orange arrow, which will expand the box for you. We're going to hold the questions until the end, but you can submit them at any time, and the Commissioner will try to respond to as many as possible during the time available. The webinar will be recorded, and we will email it out to all participants after, and you will also be able to access it on our website, where you can get the slides, the video of the webinar, as well as our full report. With that taken care of, I'd now like to introduce the Commissioner. Welcome, take away.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Well, as you saw from Michelle holding up this report, it's 280 pages, and we're not going to be able to do it all in detail in 40 minutes. I'm actually going to fly through the report in order to have time for questions. So, well, in a moment we should be able to change slides. I hope that all of you have at least the executive summary of the report, and these are the chapters that we're going to talk about very briefly. The first part of the report deals with environmental rights under the Environmental Bill of Rights, and I'm glad to report that there's been significant improvement in government compliance over the last 2 years since I became Commissioner. And then here are the other chapters we have, one on the Ministry of Environment getting risk-based approvals right, the shameful situation with pollution in Indigenous communities, the growth of algae, the partial progress on aggregates, lack of progress on protected areas, truly shameful situation with relation to species at risk, and finally Algonquin wolves. So as you all know, I hope, I'm the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights, and we take very seriously the obligations of the government to comply with the bill. And as I think many of you have heard me say before, when I was appointed as Commissioner, the level of government compliance with environmental rights was pretty low. 1,800 examples, for example, of outdated notices having been posted on the Environmental Registry, and no decisions ever having been posted which denied the public their rights to appeal. And I'm really pleased to say that that problem has been almost entirely been resolved by now. The Environmental Registry, although the software is pretty poor, is still very, very active. And I should say on that point that we're expecting the government to roll out beta test of its new and greatly improved Environmental Registry software in January. But even with the current rather inflexible software, you can see that it's really, really active. About 1,000 hits a day, 43,000 notices posted since the registry began, more than 1,800 this year alone, and most of those being instruments, of course, but 97 different policies, acts, and regulation proposals just in the last 12 months, up to March 31st, 2017. In terms of applications for investigation, this is a powerful tool under the Environmental Bill of Rights, because this is an opportunity for members of the public to formally ask, usually the Ministry of Environment, to investigate an environmental offense. And as you could see, there were 15 applications this year, 14 concluded from previous years, but there's a fairly high rate of the Ministry discovering that the complainants were right and then doing something about it, and you can see the stats there. Applications for review are more broad-ranging. This is the right that members of the public have to ask a prescribed ministry to revise or change or adopt an act, a policy, or an instrument. There's been a real problem with delays in getting these done, and there's still a long delay on some of the key requests. But even so, we're seeing an increase again in the number of applications and an increase in the way the government deals with them. And in many cases, we find that members of the public have done a real public service by bringing issues to the attention of the government and getting them dealt with. One of the big ones mentioned at the bottom there is The bill itself is rusty. It needs fixing. In 2005, our office reported that the Act needed updating. In 2010, a number of environmental groups submitted a request for review. The government accepted the request. They keep promising to actually get back with an answer, but as you can see, they still haven't done it. In terms of appeals, these are appeals to the Environmental Review Tribunal, and there were 16 appeals and applications for leave to appeal filed. 17 decided from previous years. There weren't as many new wind approvals last year, so there weren't as many appeals. That generates a lot of appeals in some years. Now, as you all know, last year we pioneered a report card for the various ministries on their compliance with the bill and the environmental rights of Ontarians. And as you can see, there's still a lot of red dots. Red dots being unacceptable conduct, but honestly it's better. One of the innovations this year is you can see the little arrows. The arrows in the dots, so green, orange, red, fairly obvious, but the arrow indicates whether things are getting better or not. And even some of the red dots really are a good sign. The ministries who posted a lot of those 1,800 obsolete proposals who finally got around to posting their notices, those answers were really, really late, but still they were cleaning up their act. And there's been a lot of work from our office in terms of outreach and hand-holding and encouraging and training with the ministry staff who have to comply with the bill. And we've found that we've had a really good response to that, and it's gone a long way in improving the competence of ministry staff in just knowing how to deal with the bill. The other thing that we're optimistic about is that the new software will make it easier for ministry staff to post higher quality notices and to attach the information they should. We've been working closely with the government staff to define what the new registry should look like, and we're cautiously optimistic that it will make all of your lives a lot easier if you use the registry. So we made some recommendations. We always have recommendations. The Statement of Environmental Values issue, this is been a continuing concern. As you all know, ministries are required to consider the Statement of Environmental Values when they make environmentally significant decisions. And they're required to document that consideration, but they usually don't tell people. So we're recommending that they should simply routinely post this. It's a matter of public interest. It's something the public are entitled to know. Did they consider the Statement of Environmental Values? And if so, how did it influence the decision? On the outstanding request for review for the Environmental Bill of Rights, after 7.5 years, obviously, we think they should go ahead and finish their review. We know that the Ministry of Environment has had more than its fair share of legislative house time in the last couple of years with the Climate Change Act and the Waste Free Ontario Act, and they're not likely to be high on the list to get more house time very soon. But even so, the bill is important. It provides a really useful tool to the public, and the review needs to be finished. And among other things, the law requires the government to complete its reviews in a reasonable time, and they clearly haven't done it. And finally, we're asking all ministries to follow the precedent that the Ministry of Environment has now set of posting regular updates on where they are with their request for review. This was an innovation that the Ministry of Environment adopted at our request, that every 3 months or so they post at least a bit of an update and they get back in touch with the applicant so they get some information about where the government is going, so that it's not simply like being treated like a mushroom for years on end. Here are some successes. There's actually quite a lot of successes that we're very proud of in the last year, but here's 2 of them. The legal hunting of snapping turtles is just an outrage. We do have a Species at Risk Act. The whole purpose of that act is to protect species who are at risk. There are only 2 species in Ontario where the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry legally allowing hunting, killing of species at risk, and snapping turtles was one of them. The other is the Algonquin wolf. So at least on the snapping turtles, the government did finally, after overwhelming public comment, agree to stop the legal killing of this species at risk. And another example was the financial assurance program. So the Ministry of Environment and the public have been caught over and over again with contaminated sites where the polluter is gone, no money is available to clean them up. So one of the problems that we pointed out is that the ministry hasn't been doing a good enough job to get their financial assurance from the people who are required to post it. So after chiding from us and from the Auditor General and the Minister of Finance, we were glad to see the Ministry of Environment has finally followed up and recovered most of the funds that were owed to them and to all of us as taxpayers. Now, every year we give an award to government staff who are particularly outstanding in their initiatives. And this is a multi-ministry team that went out of their way and did something difficult against very strong opposition. The Pollinator Health Strategy Action Plan. The targets are significant. Neonicotinoids are pesticides. There is more and more evidence that they poison the basis of the food chain. They're particularly deleterious to pollinators, but there's also more and more evidence that they adversely affect other creatures, including birds. And honeybee is particularly important for the pollination of Ontario food crops. So we want to see, the ministry wants to see reducing the mortality rate 15% by 2020. We'd sure like to see it even better than that. And pollinator habitat being protected. There's a lot of opportunities for that. Good to see some innovations, for example, with landfills and quarries, protecting, replanting native species that are good for pollinators and creating some pollinator habitat. Now that finishes the environmental rights section. Now we went into the substantive evaluation of how different ministries were doing. The first chapter was dealing with what was called the modernization of approvals. The modernization always sounds good, isn't always good. But the Ministry of the Environment has really done this well. They launched a permit by rule system for some low-risk environmental activities. As you probably all know, starting in 1971, the idea was that the Ministry of the Environment would issue an individual approval for a very large range of polluting activities. And at the time, the Ministry of the Environment had a lot of expertise on environmental issues, and basically industry didn't. And there was a tremendous amount of work over the next number of decades, which has contributed a lot to the improvement in our air quality. But by this century, the volume of approvals was very great. The delays were absurdly long and very damaging to law-abiding businesses. And it became increasingly clear that very often when the ministry actually got around to issuing an approval, it was pretty much the same as other approvals for similar activities. And so what the government decided to do, what the ministry decided to do, was that for low-risk activities, there would be a standard set of conditions that everyone in the same activity would have to follow, and they could simply opt in by registering, and then they would automatically have the right to proceed as long as they complied with the standard conditions. And as you can see, this has been quite popular. There have been thousands of registrants by this point. You see an awful lot in automotive refinishing. And there has been quite a bit of work done by the ministry to make sure that people actually comply with this. Now, this is huge. Having a regulatory system with no compliance or enforcement protocol is a sham. It doesn't change anything. This has changed things specifically because the ministry has put a lot of enforcement effort into it. And the automotive refinishing sector is a really good example. There's a lot of automotive refinishing shops are very small. They're scattered around Ontario. They may not have a lot of institutional capacity. And what we saw was that a large number of them, maybe half of them, didn't have any kind of environmental approval and yet never got caught in the enforcement compliant regime. So with the permit by rule system having been set up, the ministry then made a focused effort to go out and find these facilities and check them. And what they found was that most of them were not in compliance. In fact, I think they said 83 out of 106 facilities were in one way or another not in compliance. But after the ministry worked with them, 74 of them were found to be in compliance or got in compliance, 8 were getting close, and 1 went out of business. That's a huge improvement. So a great example of a focused effort paying off. Same thing with non-hazardous vehicle inspections. As you can see, there were an awful lot of those. There's a tremendous number of trucks hauling non-hazardous waste around Ontario, and quite a lot of them had compliance problems. And so this new system has allowed the ministry to do a sector-by-sector compliance push that has not only leveled the playing field among competitors, but increased the overall level of compliance. We think that's a really good thing. So these are the main advantages of focus on protecting the environment by having more facilities regulated and a compliance strategy. Having a level playing field so that everyone doing the same thing has the same conditions, very helpful. Also lightens the ministry's workload, that they don't have to invent the wheel over and over again for every automotive refinisher. And definitely some losses and some gains for EBR rights. We know there was a lot of concern in some of the environmental community about the loss of EBR rights because there isn't an individualized approval, there isn't an individualized posting, there isn't an individualized right to either make comments or to seek leave to appeal when the decision is issued. But we felt that that was offset, and in fact more than offset, by the opportunity to have a focused comment on the rules that apply to everybody, as opposed to simply a single facility, and greater transparency and access to information through, among other things, the Access Environment website. Now, this is not a perfect website, but, and we do think that the ministry should make it work better. It has some very interesting and frustrating quirks, as those of you who use it probably know. But still, it does have access on it to a large number of approvals that have been issued since 2000, which, without going through a lengthy process of going to a ministry office or freedom of information process, or the other difficult procedures that used to have to be followed. So these were our recommendations, that the ministry should now update old approvals for higher risk activities, basically use the resources that have been freed up, account for cumulative effects, and they now put up a proposal to do that, improve that website, and post the 100,000 plus old approvals, at least those of them that are still in force, so that people can see them. That is being reviewed in the ministry right now. So I'm going to have to hop along, I see. The largest part of the press attention was to our chapter on environmental injustice, pollution in Indigenous communities, and clearly this is a huge problem and one that the government has long ignored. Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected with pollution across Ontario, and we focused on three types of problems. Grassy Narrows and Wabsimoong. This is this absolutely tragic situation where communities that were already badly disrupted by being forcibly relocated were then subjected to mercury contamination of the river system, which has made them seriously ill for decades, and in fact worse now than ever. The dozens of First Nations communities that haven't had drinkable tap water for years or decades, and air pollution from Chemical Valley in Sarnia. So Grassy Narrows, this is really almost impossible to believe that a neurological poison as powerful as mercury was allowed. The province allowed this reed paper mill to dump 9 to 11 tons of mercury directly into the river. And mercury is an element. It doesn't break down, it doesn't disappear, and it contaminated the fish stocks throughout the river system. And it causes neurological illnesses with lifelong consequences. And so first it destroyed the commercial fishery for basically the financial basis for the entire community, but also the food that they eat. So for almost 50 years, even though Ontario knew about the importance of this issue, that there was minimata disease being suffered by the people in this area, Ontario chose to do nothing. Now the reserves themselves are under federal jurisdiction, but the paper mill is under provincial jurisdiction and the river downstream is under provincial jurisdiction. And not only that, the province willingly made a deal in 1979 to let the paper mill off the hook and to take all resulting liability onto the shoulder of the provincial taxpayers. And having done that, they then didn't clean up the contamination. So although some of it has got better, the fact is it looks as if there's still mercury leaking into the river from the mill site. If you go past the mill site even today and we take a sample just downstream in freshly deposited sediment, you have these very high levels of mercury. The province has committed $85 million, which they're putting aside in a trust fund. They said they were going to order the mill owner to do an investigation, but then they didn't. But then we hear that the ministry says they're investigating it themselves, and we look forward to hearing something from it. But one of the most tragic things about this is that 40 years ago, the level of minimata disease in this community was less than 10% based on the studies at the time. Now, of the people examined, it's well over 50%. So almost incomprehensible. But mercury builds up over time. Body burnings keep building up. Second issue is clean drinking water. And again, this is an internationally famous shame that we have so many communities where it's not safe to drink the water. 36 First Nation communities in Ontario where they've had a drinking water advisory for at least part of the community for more than a year, and 17 for more than 10 years. A lot of reasons for this. Again, a lot of the responsibility, the primary responsibility is the federal government, but the province has an important role to play as well. One of the issues is that, again, the province very often controls pollution of the sources of the water that are outside the reserve, whether from mining or other kinds of industrial activities that are regulated by the province. And then there's the whole question of providing technical support and some funding for the operators and for source water protection. So the province is doing some things on all of that. They certainly should be doing more. And they should be thinking about these communities when they issue permits for upstream activities. And that hadn't been well integrated into the provincial approval process. And then there's Aggregate. So this is a small reserve that is basically surrounded by Chemical Valley. And over the years, the community was persuaded by the Indian agent to sell more and more of their land, and the chemical industry moved closer and closer, and they're subjected to all of these various pollutants that are well known to cause health problems. Where else in Ontario is there a kindergarten where in front of the kindergarten there has to be a siren to go off when the air is dangerous to breathe and a windsock so you know what direction to run in, plus a big billboard inside with all the serious illnesses of the children. And Aggregate is one of the communities, again, famous around the world for having a skewed sex ratio, two girls to every boy, measured in 2005. And when I was there this fall, kindergarten class sang me O Canada in Ojibwe, and there were 9 girls and 4 boys, even now. And in the face of this, there's never been a proper health study, and we know that the regulations that the province is imposing, and again, the province regulates all these industries that surround the community, these regulations are known not to protect human health. The sulfur dioxide standards haven't been updated since 1974. The ministry has routinely ignored a lot of the emissions that are likely to affect health, particularly acid gas flaring, which creates these huge plumes, sometimes of flame around the community. Plus, the ministry has never considered the cumulative effect, even though there's 57 polluting facilities with heavy toxins all around this First Nations community, and the province has never considered the cumulative effects. They just treat each one as if it was the only one there, which is, again, completely unreasonable for the people who have to breathe it. There's been an inadequate monitoring and enforcement. Oh, and you can get a bit of a sense there from that picture as to how many discharge points there are, and that's just the high stacks. There's lots of other discharge points as well. These plants are designed in many cases to vent, if there's dangerous contaminants, to vent them directly into the outside air. That protects the workers, but it doesn't protect the people in the community immediately downwind. There are these sirens, as I mentioned, but they don't go off reliably. There's been inadequate information. Sometimes, as in earlier this year, the siren will go off for a few minutes and then stop, and there's no explanation as was there a problem, wasn't there a problem, who started it, who stopped it, and why. Not enough information to the medical community. An awful lot of frustration is built up for very good reason. So we made quite a few recommendations in this area, and I'm glad to say that we have been seeing some progress on this. You know, it just was something that the government knew it couldn't defend. And so there is a proposal on the Environmental Registry that came out right after our report was released to finally update the sulfur dioxide standard to take into account the information about health impacts that has been collected since 1974, was it 4 or 6? There is a proposal to also include acid gas flaring in emission modeling, absolutely critical. Public being consulted as to whether the same standard should apply in Northern Ontario or Southern Ontario. If you've got an opinion on that, I encourage you to comment. And finally, we've just seen a proposal to start thinking about how to address cumulative effects. So far, the ministry is proposing only to do it for benzene and only in Hamilton, Sudbury, and Sarnia. It's a small start, but it's an important start. Benzene's a non-threshold carcinogen. We know that the more it is, the higher the cancer risk. And it's just completely indefensible to be regulating benzene, ignoring the other 56 sources in the vicinity. So a step in the right direction. Algae. Algae is becoming surprisingly widespread. You can see the bright green on the aerial photo. This is a bad thing. Phosphorus primarily is triggered, algae is primarily triggered by excess phosphorus. It comes primarily from fertilizers and from human and animal waste that gets into the water. And so what we have to do is control phosphorus. Now, some of you will remember that in the 1970s we had an algae problem, particularly in Lake Erie, and it looked as if Lake Erie was going to die. And at the time, there was a successful response, and that successful response had 2 main prongs. One was to get phosphorus out of detergent, and the second was to get sewage treatment plants to improve their treatment. And both of those were done with great effect. And, for a few decades it seemed as if the problem was solved. But the problem is definitely not solved now, which is why we see algae blooms increasing across Ontario, not just in the Great Lakes, but also in a lot of the smaller lakes. And what we know is that now sewage plants aren't the answer. Sewage plants are generally a very small part, sometimes less than 10% of the source of phosphorus. Now it's mostly runoff from agricultural land, from urban land, from golf courses. Farm practices have changed. We know that stormwater management is not being very successful in taking phosphorus out of urban stormwater. And then we have the change in climate, which increases the intensity of rainstorms, which wash phosphorus off both urban and rural land and into the lakes, and also warms the lakes, which is favorable for the growth of these algae. So we urgently need better control of phosphorus, and what the government's been doing simply doesn't work. They have a series of programs, voluntary, unevaluated, no monitoring, no compliance, no data, where they've handed out $100 million over the last decade or so with apparently no results. The levels of phosphorus measured in the watercourses are not getting better. So we've said that's simply not acceptable anymore. The government needs to tie its financial incentives to demonstrated reductions in phosphorus, not just in the runoff, but actually in the watercourses. And interestingly enough, one of the solutions that works really well, one of the world pioneers of phosphorus trading was Ontario. The South Nation Conservation Authority in Eastern Ontario has 20 years of experience in basically taking money from sewage treatment plants who could very expensively reduce a small amount of phosphorus, and instead having farmers use that money to incent other farmers to dramatically reduce the phosphorus runoff that they have. And the South Nation Conservation Authority estimates that they've been able to achieve 20 times as much in the way of phosphorus reductions for the same amount of money. Now that's a success that we should follow. Lots of other things we could do, but bottom line is we must take it seriously, because this algae makes lakes too dangerous to swim in, to drink from, to eat fish from. There's even in Algonquin Park now lakes that canoeists are allowed to go through but mustn't stop. Mustn't stop, mustn't swim, mustn't drink, you can't treat the water. And that's just not something we want to see expanding. So there's our recommendations. I'll have to keep running. Aggregates. So aggregates are one of the topics that we get an awful lot of calls about. There's something like 175,000 hectares of land in Ontario that's licensed as pits and quarries, and they are can be really, really tough neighbors and have really significant environmental effects. So the environmental community, neighbors of both haul roads and pits and quarries have been asking for many years for an improvement of the regulatory system for pits and quarries, and so after a very, very long, very slow, very frustrating process, this year the Aggregate Resources Act was finally amended, and so we looked at it to say, okay, has this made things better? So there are two parts to the problems that are caused by pits and quarries. One is where they are, and the other is how they're operated. On where they are, there has been no progress whatsoever. That's not governed by the Aggregate Resources Act. It's governed by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs through the Provincial Policy Statement and General Planning Policy, and there has been no progress on that whatsoever. However, on the how these pits and quarries operate, this is governed by the Aggregate Resources Act, and so then the amendments have actually provided some good news on some of the questions. So as you can see, here are some of the examples. One other that's not on here is that in many cases, aggregate sites have very old approvals. Now we saw in the Ministry of the Environment the problems with very old approvals is that something that may have been okay based on the standards of the time 20 years ago is probably not okay today. Well, it's the same thing with gravel pits, and many of these older pits have very old approvals that have never been brought up to date, and there's no current data about their environmental impact, even though the population has increased, groundwater conditions may be different. So the ministry now has the right to require high-risk old facilities to do the studies necessary to update their approvals. They've never used that yet, but at least they have the power to do so, and if you're interested in this issue, I would encourage you to be asking the ministry what they're doing on this topic, because they could now do it. However, as you can see, there are some concerns that we still have that the amendments did not help with. These are outstanding issues that will continue to be a problem. The public notice period, that's something that isn't necessarily a problem with the Act. This is an administrative problem with the ministry, and we do continue to work with them to try to get them to improve the quality of their notices, and they've promised us they will, so we're hoping to see that. We made some recommendations. One of our key recommendations was having to do with lightening the footprint, because we don't have any kind of a needs test now for new pits and quarries. People can put them basically wherever they want, even if there's one right next door that's got ample capacity. The biggest part of the solution is simply not to need so much aggregate to be dug out of the ground at the very same time that we're using up an enormous amount of landfill space, knocking buildings down and carting the rubble off. And that rubble can be recycled into aggregate. So the Ministry of Transportation is actually doing a pretty good job. They're already up to 20% of their aggregate demand is being used from recycled aggregate. So what about everybody else? Municipalities have done a pretty good job. Metrolix has done a pretty good job. I see that Windows is being helpful to us here. Yes, well, thank you, Windows. We'll try to get rid of that. Don't you love that? Thank you very much. But Metrolinx, for example, is still using all virgin aggregate for their parking lots, which that doesn't make any kind of sense. And municipalities also have the opportunity to do a lot that would be helpful here. So we made some other recommendations about that. Protected areas. So this is a place where, you know, you really kind of shake your head and saying, what the heck is going on? So the countries of the world agreed that we should all protect 17% of the land and water for biodiversity, for ecosystem health, climate change adaptation, and so on. And the world average is over 14%. So here we are in Ontario with one of the biggest fairly empty land masses, small population, huge area, biodiversity, and we're worse than the world average. And not only are we worse than the world average, we're doing absolutely nothing to comply with our international obligation to have 17% by 2020. We don't even have a plan. And as reported last year, the Ministry of Natural Resources virtually zeroed out their account to pay for these things. Even if somebody wants to give the government land to be protected, they don't even have the money in that account anymore to pay the legal fees. It's just totally ridiculous. You can see some real progress was made in the 1970s, 1980s, and dratted little since then. We've got a long way to go. So we're still at 10.7%, embarrassingly low. But one of the things that was, we do need them for specific places. It wouldn't just be okay to protect a whole batch of parking lots. There are actually ecological functions that need to be protected. But one of the crazy things is if you take a look at page 208 of our report, there are a lot of types of land in Ontario that conservation authorities, land trusts, other kinds of folks are already protecting that could be part of the Protected Areas Network if the ministry would just put a little bit of effort in actually doing the inventory to classify them. And then, of course, so there's Algonquin Park, which would qualify if they would stop cutting the trees down. But we have no plan, no commitment, no budget, and they're not even looking at the list of sites that are already protected, such as some of the fabulous things that our conservation authorities do. So we had some recommendations. We have lots of good ideas as to what we think they should do. Okay. So we talked a little while ago about the Ministry of Environment using a risk-based process well to get low-risk environmental activities managed better with a risk-based approval. So Ministry of Natural Resources has very conveniently provided a mirror image of how to do it exactly wrong. Oops, okay. Michael, help. There we are. All right. So the theory was that this was supposed to be the same kind of thing. Take low-risk activities that need standard conditions, give them all the same conditions, and have a level playing field and lower administrative costs. And all of that was the way it was pitched at the beginning. Guess what? That isn't what happened. So what we noticed was, yes, of course, lots of people are registering for activities that kill or harass or harm species at risk. A lot of that for infrastructure, most of it in southern Ontario, but with little or no oversight. So, and all of the key elements of a good regulatory system, what are they? First of all, clear and effective rules. Well, we don't have clear and effective rules. Compliance and enforcement. They don't have any compliance activities. They haven't done any enforcement. There's no transparency. They don't disclose to the public what authorizations have been given or where, and no evaluation of effectiveness. So the ministry can't tell us anything about the overall impact on these species of all of these activities. And one of the extraordinary things that we found was that there are 3,000 or so occasions since the Act was passed 10 years ago where someone has come to the ministry wanting to kill or injure or harm or harass a species at risk or its habitat. And in all of those cases, there was not a single case where the Ministry of Natural Resources said no. Not one. Neither did we ever find a case where they even check to see where any of the registrants are complying with the conditions, and they give a back door for people who, there may be a special series of rules for protecting a species, but they allow people to just ignore those special rules by saying, well, eventually it might have been a health and safety danger, and so just knock it down anyway. So the whole system, there isn't a useful thing in it. Even the overall benefit permits, which were in the Act originally, and which still do get used to some extent, you can see in the gray area there are still issuing some permits, which are supposed to be given only when there's an overall benefit to the species. But the conditions that the ministry have posed don't make any sense. So if you think about Blanding's turtle, which is very threatened and extremely susceptible to population destruction if you lose even a small number of adult individuals. One of the big hazards to them is roadkill. And so the Ministry of Natural Resources, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the way to deal with the hazard to landings turtles from a road being built was to create habitat on the other side of the road that the turtles would have to cross to get there, increasing their risk of being killed on the road. So it can't make any sense of what the ministry is doing. And at the same time, the public, whole basis of the Environmental Bill of Rights is that environmental issues are too important to be left just to the government. The public has a role, and the public has been effectively shut out completely in this area. They get no public notice, they get no comment opportunities, the registrations aren't available, they get no appeal rights, they get no information, and they are unable to protect these species, which obviously the ministry isn't protecting either. So they're failing our species, and loss of biodiversity is a worldwide crisis, and here we are, a small population in a biologically rich area, a very rich country, and we are completely failing to do what we owe to these species and to our kids. Barn swallow is a really good example. Beautiful, beautiful bird. They've given 517 different registrations to harm barn swallows. Not no creation of habitat, no monitoring, no reporting, and absolutely no evaluation of the overall impact. So needless to say, we had some recommendations. You can probably guess what they are: transparency, enforcement, clear rules. This has got to be redone. And finally, here's an example. So the Algonquin wolf, it's a threatened species. It's a unique species. If you think about it in the world, it only occurs in parts of Ontario and Quebec. Best estimates are there's something not much more than 250 adults left in the world. And one of the major threats to them is being hunted or trapped, being killed in the area where they live. And here we are with a threatened species where the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry chose to strip this threatened, unique keystone species of protection in much of the habitat that it lives in. So they're an ecologically important predator. When you kill wolves, you don't get less predation. You get non-native coyotes moving in. There's little chance of them recovering as long as the ministry continues to strip them of the protection that they should be entitled to under this act throughout their range. And there you go. So we don't know exactly how many Algonquin wolves are being killed every year, but we know that a lot of canids are being killed in the area where they live every year, and more than 95 of them were identified as wolves. Again, if you kill a threatened species, you make it very hard for it to recover. So there we are. There's where the restrictions are in effect. Very small part of the only part of their habitat. So there you go. Yes, that is an absolutely cute Algonquin wolf puppy, although I suspect that he or she might grow up to be, slightly less cute. But nevertheless, there we are. Now, considering the topics for next year's report, if you have a burning topic that you think we should review next year, we've still got a few days to tell us about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, and a shout out especially to the students that are attending today. Lovely to have you on our webinar. Anybody have any questions?
Okay, and I'll just provide a reminder that we have quite a few questions here, but if you'd like to submit questions, you still can using the GoToWebinar window. If you don't see the question box, just click on the orange arrow. So I will begin now with our first question. With respect to algae, you mentioned farms and stormwater. Are septic systems also a problem creating algae blooms?
Anything that puts phosphorus into the water would contribute to algae blooms. So septic systems, if they're leaking, absolutely could. Also, we're concerned about the spreading of raw septage on agricultural land. This is something we've looked at a number of times. Ministry, this is raw human waste basically being spread on agricultural land. Phosphorus is one of the issues that we're concerned about with there. The ministry keeps saying they're reviewing it, but nothing ever seems to happen.
Thank you. Okay, the next question relates to the Amjanaw. What do you think of the MOECC's new proposals for sulfur dioxide and the proposal for cumulative effects? Do you think they're sufficient?
Well, they're huge steps in the right direction. Getting the acid gas flaring into the emission summary dispersion model by itself will be huge, because we anticipate that many of the facilities, once they do a proper model, will show themselves to be out of compliance even with the current very high sulfur level. And that will allow the ministry to begin a process of basically abatement programs to get those facilities to improve. Similarly, finally getting to a stage of looking at cumulative effects, very, very long overdue. We're also seeing some improvements, other improvements in Sarnia, where the ministry is putting more money into better monitoring equipment and taking much more seriously their responsibility to communicate with the community. The main thing I want to see is results. I want to see the air quality measurements. I want to see the benzene and sulfur levels going down in the community. Process is great, but we need results.
Okay, there's a question here about the Grassy Narrows mercury contamination. If you can explain a little bit more about what was done to determine the extent of it and where it is and what's being done to clean it up.
Cleaning it up is really difficult. You know, in some ways, you think about the old analogy, if you take a feather pillow and you slit it, you can run through the town and you can get rid of all the feathers pretty quickly, but if you need to pick them back up again afterwards, especially 50 years later, it could be quite challenging. Well, it's a bit like that. But we understand that millions of dollars are being spent on what sounds like a well-designed scientific study to actually answer those questions. Where is the mercury and what options are there? In what places can it be physically recovered? In what places can it be buried? And if so, would it stay buried with the increasing ferocity of storms? So the solution hasn't been chosen yet, but at least two good things have happened, that there does seem to be a scientifically valid process to try to come up with one. And a bill was introduced into the legislature to set aside and protect the $85 million so that it doesn't get eaten away by some different government or some other purpose. So the money will be set aside, and we'll be watching.
Okay, another one. A lot of interest on the Aboriginal Injustice chapter. Given the findings of the Environmental Injustice and Indigenous Community section, will the ECO consider pushing for environmental justice legislation?
We made a recommendation that environmental justice should be part of the reconciliation imperative that the province is pursuing. Now, what exactly that is going to mean is going to take some time and some thought. As a first step, there's so many egregious situations to be figured out. I mean, legislation, I think, is the least of our concerns at the moment. I mean, to give you just another example, Kashechewan, they were moved onto a floodplain. It floods every year. They have flooded every single year. And the federal government, in its infinite wisdom, put their sewage lagoons immediately upstream so that their water supply that's contaminated every time they get flooded, which is every single year. You know, this is, it's almost beggars belief. And so we also know that there's more than 100 high priority toxic sites on First Nations reserve lands. Again, beggars belief. So concrete action on the actual pollution seemed to be extremely important. Had a number of conversations over the last few weeks, both about drinking water and about energy supplies to First Nations communities. Those are really high priorities. The basics of a civilized life, that has to come first.
Okay, and there's a couple questions here, both about crop insurance in relation to the algae question, so I'll group them together. You mentioned crop insurance as a potential tool to reduce phosphorus. Can you elaborate on it and explain how that could possibly work?
Right, so some of you may remember that a year ago we put out a special report on soil health and the extreme importance of paying much more attention to soil health. It has many, many benefits, including resilience to both floods and droughts. But one of the other things that a high carbon soil does is it doesn't erode as much. And when it doesn't erode as much, you don't get as much phosphorus being carried into the watercourses. In addition, healthier soils don't need as much additional phosphorus added to them. So if we were able to put organic matter back into the soils at a high rate, we would expect farmers to need to put on less fertilizer, and we would expect it to stay put as opposed to washing into the rivers. That's not sufficient by itself, but it should be. And one of the things that we recommended last year is that the province shouldn't be providing hundreds of millions of dollars in crop insurance without paying any attention to the health of the soil.
Okay, I have another question here, looking if you have any more insight. You mentioned the Environmental Bill of Rights review, how it hasn't been completed. If you have any insight into why it's been stalled, why the government has completed, and if and when it might be completed.
Yes, well, as I've pointed out to people, I wasn't issued either a crystal ball or a magic wand. We did get a promise from the province in the spring that they would be publishing their response to that review by the summer, and as you can tell, that didn't happen. And then we were told it was about to happen again, and then Mr. Murray left. I have no information as to why they continue to drag their feet.
Okay. Why did it take the MNRF so long to protect snapping turtles?
You know, I can do a pretty good job answering what questions, why questions. If we don't have facts on that, I can't tell you. Ministry of Natural Resources, I do know they have tremendous difficulties balancing the scope of their mandate with their resources. Their resources were cut dramatically some years ago. Their mandate continues to expand, so perhaps that's part of the answer, but that question will be best put to them. I should say that if we don't get to your question today, feel free to email us. We're really interested in your questions, and we'd like to be as helpful as possible, but we also want to be respectful of people's time.
Okay, so it looks like we're virtually out of time, so I'm going to conclude the webinar here. As a reminder, our full report, the slides from today, as well as a video of this webinar will all be available on our website, eco.on.ca. And if we didn't get to your question, or if you have any further questions or feedback on the report, please feel free to send it to us at commissioner@eco.on.ca. And I thank you all very much for joining us today.
And one other pitch, if you could use hard copies of either the report or the executive summary in either official language, please let us know. We'd love to make them available to you and your library. Thanks very much, everybody.